You know, it's amazing after a year, it's such a lot to help with all.
6 months, that's
It calls it a game.
no,
Let me see if I can find it. That's what I say all day long. What is that good time for it? I'm getting really good at that.
Oh, wow.
Really? Yeah. That's really good. Statistician.
Congratulations.
It still hasn't So it gives me all summer practice.
Yeah, I knew waiting for that.
So you're learning Dutch. Dutch is pretty good at it, so
Oh, okay.
I feel a lot stronger.
ran into my friend Shiloh.
I wish you the best of luck with Sounds like you've actually we rush my stuff pretty hard. Definitely
I think I got it.
Oh, great.
Oh, this is exactly.
Does this work? I couldn't quite understand what.
Yeah, this is the issue that I don't have an HDMI port.
So can I just leave that with you?
Yes, I will bring it back this afternoon. Thank you.
You stayed it out, huh? What's that? Stayed it out. I stayed till.
I am. I just need a way to share this.
Sarah's going to the Dolores.
Rich and I work here. I was gonna hire him, but he's supposed to go Rich.
I am. I just need a way to share this. Karen, do you need to add something to this computer? I am. I just need a way to share this. Karen, do you need to add something to this computer? Yeah. I am. I just need a way to share this. Karen.
We almost.
my favorite
Just one really cute picture.
Yeah, I realized that.
Only in the best way. If I get this picture.
It might be on.
Oh, it's on the other screen. That's why I can't see it. Alright, I opened it up twice. Although that might be, that's yours. That is you. That's not me. Maybe it didn't work.
Do I have any more space over on this?
But are you running this off your laptop? Because maybe.
No. So I've got a webcam and a.
Okay.
You can try emailing it to me. Because I did get the internet up.
Problem is, well, okay.
Or you can try one of these ports down here.
You're getting pretty good at this technology here.
I don't know if running it off the desktop.
That's correct. So then, and do you want my pointer?
Huh? Is it a pointer clicker?
Yeah.
That would be.
Oh, people getting quiet. Oh.
Sorry for my confusing setup.
No, not at all. It looks like there's something new. There we go. Except for I am not. There we go. Alright. So, step aside. Right. All right, we are going to get started here. If I could have everybody's attention. Thanks so much for coming on this very exciting day. I just want to do a very brief introduction of Becka and just show a few historic photos just to set the mood. I think one of the best parts about well, I should introduce myself first since I know there are some folks here who don't know me. I am Becca's PhD advisor, and we've been working together for quite a few years. One of the best parts about my job, though, is I've come to realize how much I can learn from the students as much as I share with them. And very early on, when I got to USU quite a few years ago now, Becka asked me if she could interview me for her master's thesis work that she was doing with Joanna Enterwada. And she asked me all these really articulate, super interesting questions about Western water law and policy and what that meant for wetlands. I'd just gotten off the airplane from the East Coast. I had literally no idea what she was talking about. And over the next few years, I really learned a whole lot from Becka, and through collaborations with Joanna and Lisa Welsh about Western water law and what that means for wetlands. And so she's really brought this unique policy perspective and now has been working in the ecology realm these past few years. But I think that's really enriched what's been going on in our lab. In addition to that, I think one of the greatest parts of my job is seeing people develop, students develop over a number of years and seeing the full impact of what they have done. And so when Becka began her PhD work, we didn't really have detailed understanding of the hydrology of Great Salt Lake wetlands, the vegetation, the plant communities. And so you'll hear about that today. But I was actually going back to some of her early proposals, and one of the questions she posed was something to the effect of, do you think I could make a guess at Great Salt Lake wetland hydrology? Well, she's come a long way from there, and so she'll be talking a lot about some of the interesting things she's found about Great Salt Lake wetland hydrology. In addition to that, she has developed this amazing data set on Great Salt Lake wetland plants, and it's going to have a further reaching impact than her dissertation research. So one of the other things that's coming out of her dissertation is the Great Salt Lake Wetland Plant Guide that's going to be super helpful for students in my lab and hopefully a number of those of you out there working in Great Salt Lake wetlands. And so in addition, it's been really fun to see, I don't know anybody who's more passionate about Great Salt Lake wetlands than Becka, and she's got this great blog, Winding Science, and Twitter account where, well, you have to ask her about the marsh llama at some point if you don't know the story on that one. But she features a wetland plant of the day. So she's really sharing her love of Great Salt Lake wetlands more broadly, and I think we've really appreciated that. So interestingly, I think going forward, I went again back to some of our early conversations. Becka, I asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up, when you graduate? She said, I want to be a Toby. Where's Toby? Toby's somewhere in here. So since that time, Toby has moved on to a new position, and Becka is now a wetland scientist at Utah Division of Water Quality. So I'm super excited that she'll be around for the duration to continue her positive impact on Great Salt Lake wetlands. That's going to be, I think, a real boon for our lab as well. And then one final comment I just want to say, one of the great things that Becka has done as part of her work too is that she's been involved. She's surveyed 50 wetland sites. Well, that means she's worked with federal managers, state wetland managers, private duck club owners, a number of wetland managers who are here today. And it's been so fantastic to have all of you work with Becka and our lab over the past few years on this research. And so I think going forward with her position in Division of Water Quality and our wetland work, I'm excited for what's to come in the future, particularly with Becka's new position. So with that, I will turn it over to Becka, and we can hear about what she's been up to these last few years.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be juggling a little bit of technology here. I'm trying to live stream this, so hopefully it won't be too distracting. What I'm going to present to you today is the result of 4 years of studying wetland condition in Great Salt Lake wetlands, really focusing on the plants that are out there and the people that are controlling them. Sorry, I'm not wearing my shoes. They're really uncomfortable. So there's a lot of information here, and to get through it, I'm going to move pretty fast, but I've broken this into 5 basic pieces. First, an introduction to what wetlands are, Great Salt Lake wetlands, and condition, and what that means. Then I'll go into talking about impounded wetland management and its impact on condition, followed by another chapter on the hydro period of Great Salt Lake wetlands, trying to make a guess at what's going on there, and then discuss the way condition, the way I've measured it, links up to management in these wetlands, and finally looking at whether there's a link between any ecological functions and wetland condition. So if I've spoken to you at all, you know I'm really, really passionate about wetlands, but these are places that not a lot of people like to spend time. So if you don't know, a wetland is a place where water is flooded or just below the soil surface for long enough in the year to lead to the development of a unique type of soil called hydric soils. They look and they smell different from other soils. And there's enough flooding that we also see the development of a unique plant community composed of hydrophytic vegetation. Flooding in wetlands is really important, and the patterns of flooding over time are what distinguish different wetland types. So here I've got several wetland types from around the Great Salt Lake, and in ponds you're going to see a hydro period that provides consistent flooding over the most of the year. As that flooding gets less deep or less permanent, you see the development of emergent marshes, meadows, and playas. Disruptions to that hydro period are going to disrupt the way the wetlands function, and we have a lot of really valuable functions we get from wetlands, including retention and cycling of pollutants. They attenuate floods, and in Great Salt Lake, the function we care most about is the fact that they provide a lot of habitat for wetland-dependent migratory species. Wetlands tend to lie at the bottom parts of watershed, seen here with these little wetlands down at the bottom of rivers, and because they are in these low-lying places, they're subject to a lot of impacts. Drought is particularly pervasive in the western United States because our rivers have been diverted before that water reaches the wetlands. There's also issues with pollution. The water that does come to the wetlands is carrying everything that it's gathered along its river course. Adjacent land uses are going to change the species present in a wetland, and they're also going to change when water is running off. There's also physical disturbances like roads and canals that can break up big wetland complexes, and then other things that we do with our land like grazing or spraying herbicides or using fire. All of these can potentially have a negative impact on the way a wetland works. And these are all really relevant to Great Salt Lake wetlands. So Utah is the second driest state in the country. We don't have a lot of wetlands, but we do happen to have 1,400 square kilometers of wetlands adjacent to the Great Salt Lake, where the Bear, Weber, and Jordan rivers flow in. The Great Salt Lake is terminal and hypersaline. What that means is that the water in the lake can't be reused for human consumption. The environment can use it, and the environment really likes it. But because humans can't use it, legally that water has been viewed as wasted, and a lot of it has been diverted before it ever reaches the wetlands and the Great Salt Lake itself. This led to some serious issues with loss of wetlands and outbreaks of avian diseases around the Great Salt Lake. So as far back as the 1920s, managers started building these impoundments in order to buffer the effects of losing all of that water. So I've got a little video here to show you what I'm talking about when I talk about impounded wetlands. You can see on the right side of this, that's an impoundment. This is outside the impoundments, and it's gonna spin a little bit. So if you get super motion sick, let's see. But the thing to look at is just what a distinct difference there is inside and outside of the impoundments. For my master's degree, I studied the policy implications of this, and being able to impound wetlands like this gives managers the ability to flood them for longer, buffer them against drought. It also gives this extra ability to manage water, to send it where they want to, and then politically, it gives them the ability to apply for a water right. When I started explaining this to people outside of Utah, though, they thought it was crazy because what an impoundment does is it disrupts the natural hydro period of a wetland. Whether it disrupts it more than having all of the water sent away is really what I was interested in. So the entire goal of my PhD has been to understand what the impact of impoundment and water management has been on the ecology of Great Salt Lake wetlands. I was curious if managing water specifically for migratory birds maybe led to some trade-offs in the other functions that we expect our wetlands to provide. To do this, to disentangle all of the things that were impacting wetlands, I developed a condition assessment specific to Great Salt Lake wetlands. Wetland condition is the ability of a wetland to maintain its structure and function in the face of disturbance. So wetlands in high condition don't experience a lot of disturbance, and they have a very natural biotic community, and they provide all of the functions they normally would. As disturbance increases, condition is impaired. The biota don't look the same, and the functions have been altered. Where impoundment fits in with our original list of disturbances is really what I was hoping to figure out. So the idea behind a condition assessment is that we can actually measure change in the biology of a system over the course of, or over a disturbance gradient. Where disturbance is low, we expect to see a natural, robust biology. And in wetlands, the part of the biota that we're measuring is going to be plants, because they are generally responsive to disturbances. And there's a large body of literature discussing ways that we expect the plant community to change in the face of disturbance. As disturbances increase, we expect to see an increase in species richness, and the additional species are probably not going to be native. They probably won't be wetland species, and they're probably going to be really short-lived species. And we expect there to be kind of a gradient of these changes. At the most disturbed end, we expect to see poor condition, where the plant community is not full of native wetland plants. A key part of this is establishing reference condition, that natural, pristine state that we're going to compare all of our changes against. And in its simplest form, reference condition is defined as natural or pristine. This is a big, oh, Scar. I'm not sorry. This is a challenge in wetlands because they lie at the bottom of watersheds so frequently. Natural or pristine is not really something that exists. This is particularly true for Great Salt Lake wetlands because of the wide impact of diverting water from our rivers. So there's other options like least or minimally disturbed condition, assuming that there is going to be some level of disturbance everywhere, but there is going to be a less disturbed set of wetlands that we can compare change against. And then there are more qualitative forms of reference condition, like best attainable condition or best professional judgment. So some of the challenges of doing this around Great Salt Lake that I ran into early is first the widespread nature of anthropogenic disturbances. There's not a lot of water available around the Great Salt Lake, and that's not a natural condition. That's because we divert a lot of it. The water that does come back generally has impaired water quality. We've got some big problems with invasive species that are going to throw off our measures of the plant community. And then we have this impounded management thing that might be a disturbance or it might not, but it's definitely not natural. In addition to this, there's a natural salinity gradient that changes from distance between the lake and sources of fresh water, and it also changes over time, which confounds some of the influences of disturbance. And finally, these wetlands have much lower species richness than we would expect in other regions where salinity and drought aren't driving parts of the plant community. So these are some of the things that we tried to work through over the past 4 years. While I was doing this, I was also curious if the data that I was gathering to measure plant condition could tell me anything about the habitat function that we value in our Great Salt Lake wetlands, whether it had any relevance to the management goals, and if we could look and see what the hydroperiods of wetlands are around the Great Salt Lake. So to gather data on all of this, I used this multi-pronged approach. I developed a vegetation-based condition assessment based on 4 years of plant sampling. I also gathered high-frequency water level data. I conducted semi-structured interviews with managers of the wetlands that I was assessing, and then I did some habitat species-specific sampling to get at wetland functions. And now you know everything about wetlands and condition. So I'm going to move on to looking at what my assessment shows of the impact of impoundment on wetland condition. So I randomly selected 50 wetlands from around the Great Salt Lake to compare the impacts of impoundment. Half of my sites were from inside impoundments, the triangles there, and then half of them were outside the impoundments. I also stratified my sample by 4 separate shoreline regions: the Bear, Ogden, and Farmington Bays, and the south arm of the Great Salt Lake. And I did this to capture the full range of disturbances that we would expect these wetlands to face, from more agricultural influences up north to more industrial and urbanized uses down in the south. I surveyed these wetlands every summer from 2012 to 2015. 2012 ended up being kind of a pilot project year where we were learning that we really needed to get hydrology data in detail. So the data that I'll be presenting from here on out is from 2013 to 2015. This period of time also coincided with a pretty severe drought in northern Utah, which decreased stream flow at the mouth of these rivers anywhere from 72% of normal to 16% of normal. So they're pretty dry, challenging conditions to survey in. I did all of my data collection along a modified transect design. I took whole National Wetland Inventory polygons and put in a transect from the highest, driest point in the wetland down to the lowest, most deeply flooded wetland, and I evenly distributed all of my data sampling along that. And I did this to try and capture differences in large wetlands and tiny wetlands. I did vegetation sampling in 5 25 square meter quadrats. I dug soil pits and looked at what the soils looked like. At the lowest point in the wetland, I installed a piezometer that measured the water level every hour. And at this point, I also gathered a soil chemistry sample to try and get at what levels of nutrients and salinity and other things these wetlands had. To get at physical disturbances, I tacked on a 100-meter buffer around the outside of this and looked for physical disturbances within there as well as within the site. And then within a 1 kilometer or 1,000-meter landscape envelope, I used GIS data to determine what the dominant land uses were adjacent to these wetlands. And then I took all of this data and calculated 2 basic things. The first was a disturbance index. This is a cumulative score of all of the type of disturbances these wetlands face, from land use disturbances all the way to hydrologic disturbances. And I built that into one single score. So at the high end of the disturbance index, we have wetlands that are facing the most severe and the most different types of disturbances. And at the low end, we have relatively undisturbed wetlands. And this is what I determined to be my reference condition. This is minimally disturbed condition, and it's the bottom 15th percentile on that disturbance gradient. I then used all of this field data to calculate a wide variety of metrics of the plant community, ways to describe what species were present. And then I selected a subset of those metrics to be built into an index of condition, a single measure of the relative health of these wetlands. I selected metrics that were that showed change along the disturbance gradient that we established and that were highest in reference condition, making sure to exclude collinear variables that were telling us maybe the same thing about a wetland, and variables that were strongly zero inflated. I then used ANOVAs, primarily, analysis of variance, to look at the relationship between condition and disturbance. I came up with 4 separate measures of what condition might be. The first 2 assumed that we can compare impounded and unimpounded wetlands, and we can measure condition within them the same way. And I got stuck there for a long time, and those are the results that I presented if you've seen any earlier presentations of these. And what it looked like is that the anthropogenic influence index that we calculated, that I've got going from left to right here, had a really strong impact on condition, which I've got measured here. At low disturbance, we had high condition, and condition decreased as disturbance increased. However, when I plotted this separately for impounded and unimpounded wetlands, what we found is that there was actually no statistically significant response within impounded wetlands over the disturbance gradient. Our p-value was not significant, and the r-squared value, kind of the measure of the strength of that relationship, is really, really low. So what this said to me was that there is something inherently different between impounded and unimpounded wetlands. Either they're facing different types of disturbances, or the plant community is different enough that we need to measure different things to capture the responsive disturbance. So I'm going to show a variation on this graph again. Whenever you see triangles, these are impounded wetlands. The circles are unimpounded wetlands, and then the different colors are going to be the different shoreline regions I sampled from. So after much suffering and thinking about it, started back at square one, splitting my sample into impounded and unimpounded wetlands, which meant that I needed to select reference conditions specific to impounded wetlands and unimpounded wetlands. I stayed with minimally disturbed reference conditions, so the low end of that anthropogenic influence index. And if you take a look at our stereotypical impounded and unimpounded wetlands, there's a visible difference between these plant communities that we're going to explore a little bit more. So, going into the details of the differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands, my disturbance index had 3 components that I weighted equally. Land use disturbance, measured as the agriculture and developed land uses nearby. Hydrologic disturbance, which is measured as the mean water table depth over the growing season, the percent of the season the wetland was dry, and the standard deviation, a measure of the range of water depths experienced there. And then there's also a management component, actions like spraying herbicide or grazing a wetland that was driving change in the plant community. There were 6 metrics that responded to these different types of disturbance. So I've got a box plot for each of these metrics, and each of these boxes is a different condition category. So the dark boxes, these are our reference condition, and then the lighter boxes are decreasing condition. So good condition wetlands, those were the top third in the emergent marsh condition score. Poor condition wetlands, those were the bottom third of that score, what we think is in poorest condition, most different. And the unique letters at the top of these indicate that the metrics are significantly different between each group. So within impounded wetlands, we measure reference and condition as vegetated area. In reference wetlands, there's very little bare ground. Species richness, which is lowest in our reference sites, generally about 4 species. The species that are present are primarily native species, and they have a high mean C score. It's a measure of how valuable these species are for conservation. They're primarily obligate wetland species and monocot species, grasses and sedges. And each of these metrics decreases as disturbance increases. When you add it all up together as one, my condition score, or the emergent marsh condition index, and plot it across a disturbance gradient, we see we've got a statistically significant relationship between the two, and an R-squared of 0.33. Our disturbance gradient is explaining about 30% of the change in the plant community measured by our condition score. When I looked at unimpounded wetlands, one of the first things that jumped out is that disturbance isn't the same within unimpounded wetlands. I had the same 3 components, land use, hydrology, and management, but I had to take out the standard deviation of the water table depths because that had a different impact from the amount of drying. The plant community actually responded positively to large fluctuations in water level. I also took out herbicide. Outside of impoundments, having herbicide sprayed nearby actually had a positive impact on the plant community, which suggests it's a great management strategy potentially. So that's the initial differences between those. One of the key things that you might have noticed is missing in both of these disturbance indices is the presence of physical disturbances like roads and canals. Those did not have a measurable impact on any of the plant community metrics that I calculated. There also aren't any soil chemistry factors like salinity, nutrients, pH. They varied a lot from year to year, and the nature of their impact changed from year to year. So sometimes they seem to have a positive influence on the plant community, sometimes a negative influence. There's something happening with the water quality and the soil chemistry there that I wasn't able to capture with a single visit. So within the condition index for unimpounded wetlands, there were 4 metrics that responded significantly to that disturbance index. Species richness again, which was lowest in reference sites, but a bit higher in unimpounded wetlands. reference wetlands had an average of 8 species per site. Most of those species were native with a high mean C-score, but there weren't a lot of obligate wetland species, even in reference wetlands outside of the impoundments. Instead, condition here was measured as a combination of both obligative and facultative wetland species, species that were adapted to these more fluctuating water regimes. Plotted all together, again, we have condition across a disturbance gradient, and condition does decrease in a statistically significant way across this disturbance gradient, but the R squared is not really impressive on this. Basically, our disturbance index is explaining 16% of the variation in the plant community, and something else that I didn't measure is driving a lot of these disturbances. This is something that's going to come up again and again. Basically, unimpounded wetlands are really unpredictable and have been a challenge throughout this. So what are the differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands? I went back to my vegetation data to try and explore this. So this is an ordination of the most common species in impounded and unimpounded wetlands. It takes all the data and smushes it into two axes. And species that are farther apart on these graphs are less likely to be found in the same plant community. And then you can put environmental gradients across the top of these and see what might be driving the changes in the plant community. The colors are different wetland plant functional groups. So browns are terrestrial species. The light colored are early and annual wetland species that grow really fast. And then the blues are our robust and submerged perennial species, these long-lived stereotypical wetland species. In impounded wetlands, there's some pretty clear relationships here. Where we have a lot of drought stress or a lot of land use stress, we don't have as many of our long-lived perennial wetland species. If you take a look at unimpounded wetlands, these environmental gradients are all pointing in different ways. They're having conflicting influences potentially. And we also have a lot more differences in the plant communities. One of the key differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands is that our unimpounded wetlands don't have as many of these robust and submerged perennial species, which can really only be found in places where flooding is deep and relatively consistent. So that was a lot. But to summarize it all, what I found the impact of impoundment to be was to create and maintain this unique wetland type inside the impoundments, and keep another more dynamic wetland type outside of the impoundments, which has increased the diversity of different wetland types on the landscape. Couldn't really say if impoundment has a positive or negative impact on condition. Instead, it's had this impact to create diversity. But I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to know what within the disturbance index we measured was actually driving condition. So I built a linear regression equation that predicted condition as a function of the 3 components from my disturbance index. The land use, the hydrologic, and the management disturbances. And you can look at the slope coefficient for each of those predictors, and the larger the coefficient, the stronger the influence on your predicted value. And then you can rank that. And what I found is within both wetland types, land use had the strongest influence. However, you can't really change land use if you're looking to improve your management or maybe do a restoration. Houses and farms are generally going to stay there. But hydrologic disturbance was our next most important factor. And because we have these impoundments, this is one of the features that we can actually control if we're trying to improve condition along the landscape, which is what we're going to talk about next. What is the hydro period of Great Salt Lake wetlands? How is it different between our wetland types? And how is it different across our disturbance gradient? One of the key things you learn when you take a wetland ecology class is that hydrology and the hydro period is responsible for the structure and function. And within that textbook, you're going to find literal textbook examples of what the hydro period of different important regional wetland types are. Tidal wetlands fluctuate a lot. Vernal pools are rarely flooded. But I didn't find Great Salt Lake wetlands anywhere within that. I just didn't know what was going on. And this is what I found during my first year of study. I had piezometers at a subset of sites, 15, and I downloaded all of the data and plotted it across time. And I could tell that things were different between sites, but I didn't know what mattered. So in 2013, we went out and made sure to study piezometers at all the sites. This is a piezometer, and David, who is responsible for installing most of these. What it is a well with slotted PVC in the bottom. So water comes into the well from the bottom. It measures the water table there. And then it's got an automated pressure transducer that measures the depth over time as the weight of the water on top of that. I need to pause for a second and make a quick distinction. Outside of wetlands, when we talk about hydrology, we tend to be talking about flow and change in storage. These are both exceptionally difficult to measure in wetlands because flow is almost imperceptibly slow, and we don't have water all year long. And we would expect similarities across regions if flow was the most important thing to measure. Instead, what we see is within the same region, which is what each of these plots are, there's a lot of site-specific variation that we can capture by measuring the water table depth. And this is also the aspect of the hydrology that plants are most adapted to. So I'm going to try to stick to the term hydroperiod, this pattern of flooding and drying over time. If I slip and say hydrology, know that I'm not talking about flow or hydrology in that traditional sense. So our regression analysis and just looking at the hydroperiods can show us that there are some pretty significant differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands. So you're going to see a few plots like this, and what it shows is depth to water from May until October. Anything above that solid line indicates that there's flooding. Anything below it is saturation or drying, and anything below this dotted line indicates the water table is below the root zones of plants, what I consider dry. I chose to just plot 2015 because there are too many lines otherwise. And looking at this, we can see, some of the differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands, but I used ANOVA analysis to really see if those were statistically significant differences across years. I calculated many more potential metrics to describe those hydroperiods, but they fell into three basic categories. Basics that describe like the mean, minimum, and maximum. Ways to characterize the magnitude and number of water level fluctuations. And then the timing of different things like flooding, drying, and depth within biologically meaningful periods of time. What this shows in the dark green boxes are any significant differences across region, year, wetland type, or condition categories in impounded and unimpounded wetlands. We do have some distinct differences between our regions, which we would expect because of changes or differences between the three rivers that flow into the Great Salt Lake. Strangely, there were no significant differences in anything I calculated across years. Remember, this was a drought in northern Utah, but we didn't see it reflected in broad patterns across Great Salt Lake wetlands. There were a lot of differences between our impounded and our unimpounded wetland types, a lot of relationships between condition in impounded wetlands and our potential metrics, and not very many in unimpounded wetlands. So I want to go into details on how we would describe the differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands. There was a lot, but I wanted to focus in on those three pieces that were part of our disturbance index. Mean depth to water, the standard deviation of those water depths over the growing season, and then the percent of the growing season that was dry. And what we see is that in impounded wetlands, they're flooded more deeply. They don't experience the same range of water level fluctuations. They have a narrow range. And they spend less of the growing season dry. Outside of impoundments, we're not flooded very deeply. Those water depths fluctuate a lot. and were drier for longer. That's kind of expected when you think about what impoundments are. So the more interesting question was, how do we distinguish between the hydroperiods of different condition? So these are just impounded wetlands, just 2015. The hydroperiods of these different condition categories. And again, we have our well-behaved reference wetlands and a lot going on outside of those reference wetlands. So were there any significant differences in the hydroperiods among these categories? I conducted t-tests to compare the mean values of mean depth to water, standard deviation again, and the percent dry across our condition categories. What I found is that there were significant differences between these metrics in the reference and poor condition communities. So there is a different hydroperiod in poor condition wetlands. But there's a lot of overlap in what the hydroperiod looks like between reference and good and sometimes reference and fair condition wetlands. And I just plotted one of my stereotypical impounded wetland sites. What you see is that from year to year, these wetlands tend to look pretty similar. In unimpounded wetlands, these nice clean relationships tend to fall apart. These are the same condition categories except in unimpounded wetlands. And it was really, I started these for a long time trying to figure out what it all means. Dug back into the data and looked to see whether there was any significant differences in those three metrics again across our condition categories. And it was sometimes. The unique letters indicate that there's a difference between any of these categories. There's no significant differences in mean depth to water across condition categories. There is difference in standard deviation, with our reference wetland sites experiencing wider fluctuations in depth to water than our poor condition sites. This is counterintuitive, but what I think it means is that outside of impoundments, the water depth isn't fluctuating very much, and it's really far below the water table, or really far below the root zone, so they just dry and they stay dry. The percent of the growing season that was dry, where the water table was below the root zone, however, did not differ significantly across any of our condition categories. And looking at one of my sites again over the 3 years of my study, that's the same place from year to year. These are just really dynamic systems. One last way to look at this is using a cumulative distribution function. This takes kind of the time part of it out. So you can look at the cumulative percent of time a water depth was exceeded. So this end is dry, this end is flooded, and our reference wetlands have a really steep curve. They're almost always well above, they're almost always flooded. We have kind of a narrow range of distributions within our unimpounded reference wetlands. But as we get away from reference condition, there's a whole bunch of different ways the hydroperiod could potentially be impaired. So now we're done with that section, and the conclusions that we can make from that is that the differences between impounded and unimpounded wetlands in the hydroperiod are that impounded wetlands are flooded more deeply for longer. And in looking at drivers of condition, we can say something basically just for impounded wetlands, that the drier and more dynamic impounded wetlands get, the poorer the condition. When I started talking to wetland managers about what I was finding, all of this was kind of like, duh. Like, these wetlands are different, and it's due to the ability to flood them deeply. However, I was still interested in not only hearing what they thought about my data, but seeing if any of the information that I had gathered could potentially improve management around the Great Salt Lake. I was also interested in recording the strategies of wetland management around Great Salt Lake. We've been impounding and managing water in wetlands for coming up on 90 years now, but there hasn't been any real synthesis about what the goals are and what the best strategies are. So I started by interviewing the managers of the wetlands that I assessed. You can see the different ownership types on this map here. There's a large federal wildlife refuge in green. So I started there. There's also a number of state waterfowl management areas in yellow. I interviewed the managers there. And then there's a number of private hunting clubs and conservation areas. So I went to ask them all about what their goals and strategies are, what they monitor to determine the success of their management strategies, and what they think high condition is. I used a semi-structured interview approach with a 13-question interview protocol where I asked them site-specific questions about my data, asked them about what they were doing in their management areas and why, any changes that they had seen over time, and what they monitored there. And then I asked general perspectives on wetland management around Great Salt Lake, including what they consider reference condition to be. This was one of the most interesting parts of my research. We have people out there who've been managing or hunting and managing for decades. They knew a lot of things that I didn't pick up in the 4 years of my study. All of these interviews were recorded. They lasted approximately 2 hours, and then I had them professionally transcribed. And I analyzed the transcript for common themes in wetland management, including the goals and strategies, as well as constraints on management. Looked for any consistent monitoring efforts, and then tried to pull out a condition index based on best professional judgment as my reference condition. So the goals of wetland management across all of those different ownership types are pretty consistent. Managers are looking to create conditions conducive to supporting all of the wetland-dependent migratory birds that visit Great Salt Lake, more than 250 species. This was a little bit surprising because I expected management to be based strictly on waterfowl. That's what's hunted, and that's the primary reason these areas were preserved. And there is a lot of focus on waterfowl, but it's not the sole focus. We also have areas where we're trying to preserve habitat for shorebirds, smaller birds. And there's been this move to go towards protecting or creating habitat for priority species, a number of different bird groups. The strategy for doing this is impounded water management. This is the greatest tool managers have to be able to create the habitat to support the birds that they want. However, the details of the strategy, what hydrologic conditions they're trying to create, vary a lot between ownership types. Most generally, what the goal of impounded water management is to do is to impede plant succession, to introduce a drawdown to leave the plant community where it is as robust emergent perennials and submerged aquatic species. Aside from trying to incorporate some sort of drawdown or drying period within there, there's also an effort to protect nesting birds, to make sure that they've got a space to be and make sure the water levels don't fluctuate enough to expose them to predators or flood out their nests. There's a whole bunch of constraints to being able to pursue whatever strategy a manager was interested in. Up north, water availability is the primary constraint. It's not very predictable how much water the Bear River is going to bring down, but it's likely that there's not going to be a lot of water available for wetlands late in the summer. Phragmites is another big constraint. When wetlands are drawn down, that's a great time for Phragmites to kind of expand across that open soil. So managers are leery to let that drawdown happen for fear that their habitat is going to be pushed out by an invasive species. And then the requirement to maintain hunting access is one of the other constraints, particularly in publicly managed areas, that requires keeping flooding to a depth adequate for waterfowl, particularly birds like mallards, and deep enough that people can get their boats through. So management is complex. And there's a lot of challenges to or a lot of threats. First is water availability. Not only does it constrain what we can do, but it's likely to become less available as populations grow around Great Salt Lake and as climate change keeps affecting our snowpack. Urbanization is also a potential threat. Utah's got a really fast-growing population, and most of that population lives adjacent to Great Salt Lake. And then Phragmites. is, it's just a monster out there. And there are a lot of other theses and dissertations you can look at to get more of that. One of the things that was consistent...
That was the clearest, though.
Yes. When I asked, what do you consider to be the healthiest or best conditioned wetlands? I was really surprised at the level of agreement between my managers. What they would like to see is a wetland where there's an elevation and a water depth gradient. There's flooded places and dry places and deep flooded and shallow flooded that would support feeding of a number of different bird groups. It would also create a variety of vegetation types. This goes towards their goal of supporting as many different bird groups as possible. And then little to no Phragmites. When I asked about what management strategy it would take to maintain these wetlands, again, consensus falls apart. Some wanted to keep it flooded stably all year long. Others thought natural fluctuations were good, or maybe unnatural frequent fluctuations. So what I did with all of this is I built an additional condition index based on two metrics. A hemi-marsh ratio, which is the ratio of open water to emergent plant vegetation. This is good nesting habitat. And then the relative cover of 5 important species: Bulbochenus maritimus, Disticula spicata, Salicornia rubra, and 2 big bulrushes, Shenoplectus acutus and Shenoplectus americanus. So I called this index, based on best professional judgment, Migratory Bird Habitat Score, where reference condition were wetlands with a lot of hemi-marsh and a lot of cover of those habitat species. And I compared that to my condition index, which I've got going from left to right. And what I found is in impounded wetlands, there is a statistically significant relationship between the two, but it's not very strong, and I'm really suspicious of it. Outside of impoundments in our unimpounded wetlands, there is no visible or significant relationship between wetlands that have good habitat potential and wetlands that I measured in good condition. This was kind of a bummer. I'd hoped that high condition wetlands were also really good habitat. But one of the positive notes to come out of this is that it doesn't appear that there's a trade-off between trying to manage for migratory bird habitat and condition. If that had been the case, there would be a strong negative relationship between habitat potential and condition. So I just wanted to briefly explore what might be driving these differences between what managers are hoping to see and what I measured as condition. And I think the primary difference between those is scale. Management is happening on the scale of tens of thousands of acres. They're trying to maintain these diverse complexes. And my condition assessment focused on one wetland type within discrete wetland boundaries. So there's just not a lot of comparability between there. And then the temporal scale. Management happens on a daily basis. We go around and see what the water levels are and where the birds are and move water accordingly. My condition assessment happened annually, and then I waited for 5 years to really come up with the results. I think there's also differences between the drivers of condition, which were primarily disturbance, and the drivers of habitat potential, which might be disturbance as well as a number of other environmental gradients. So to summarize, the goal of wetland management is to provide habitat for wetland-dependent wildlife. Strategies are diverse. There's very little overlap between condition and habitat potential, and that disagreement is probably differences in both scale and drivers. So we're going to talk about those drivers in this very last section. What I was hoping to do is make a quantitative measure of the habitat function, the ecological function we value most around Great Salt Lake, and then compare that to condition. The goal is seeing if maybe this more quantitative measure of habitat lines up with condition. Further, I wanted to know what makes our important habitat species grow. So within the 50 sites that I originally assessed, I did species-specific sampling in wetlands that had large patches of these wetland types. Again, these are our 5 important habitat species. We've got 3 species of bulrushes, Bulbochenus maritimus, Shenoplectus acutus, and Shenoplectus americanus. These are big plants with big seeds. And then we have two halophyte species, Disticula spicata and Salicornia rubra. And so wherever there was at least 25 by 5 meter patches of just those individual species, I sampled above ground biomass, flowering stem density, and the weight, which is a measure of the number of seeds produced by individual plants. I did this in 2014 and 2015, so that's the time period you'll see this data for. The two basic functions that I came up with were a cover function measured as biomass. This is the amount of nesting material and kind of hiding spots within vegetation for migratory birds, and then a food function measured as the seed mass produced there. And then I split up these potential functions by all species present at a site, the halophytes, are small salty plants, and bulrushes. I did analysis of variance to compare how high habitat function lined up with condition, and then I built mixed effects models for each species. So there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of details. You can read about it in my dissertation. I'm going to have to go over it fast because it's also boring. But what I did is build in a random effect to account for differences in impounded and unimpounded wetlands. And then I selected from a suite of 21 environmental predictors to see what might be driving the presence of any of these species, biomass, and flowering stem density. And these predictors included the land use disturbance from our disturbance index, as well as physical disturbances like roads. I used a whole bunch of hydroperiod statistics in addition to what went into the disturbance index. And then here's one of the places I was able to use the soil chemistry data that I gathered. So these are, again, the ANOVA-based relationships between each of my functions and condition across Great Salt Lake wetlands, condition in impounded wetlands and unimpounded wetlands. Anywhere where you got a dark green box, there was a statistically significant relationship. The brown, no relationship. And I also compared this to disturbance, wetland type, region, and year. And what we see is there really aren't any noteworthy relationships between the food and cover functions and any of these. There is a very, very weak relationship between bulrush biomass and seed production and condition, but the R-squared value is 0.04, which is not terribly compelling. And plotted across conditions, so this is our cover function. The different colors are the different groups, all of the species, bulrushes and halophytes, across a condition index in impounded. No, I didn't split them out this way. Cover, food. And it looks like a mess because it is. There's just not any strong relationships between condition and these functions. But I suspected that these were due to species level differences. Those habitat functions were lumping together very different species. So the next step was to look into the drivers of habitat. This is the boring part, but what I did was plot presence, biomass, and flowering stem density across the most, or the strongest predictor of that. And then I listed the other predictors down here. I don't expect you to actually read all of it, but the point of it all is that the drivers of each species are diverse, far more diverse than condition. So for saltgrass, Disticula spicata, it was more likely to be present where soil ammonium was low. It grew bigger, produced more biomass, where land use in the surrounding kilometer was primarily wetlands, and where soil pH was higher, more alkaline. Salicornia rubra responded to a whole different suite of predictors. It was present most often where salinity was high. It produced more biomass where surrounding road density was rather low. And it, the strongest predictor of flowering stem density was latitude, with fewer plants and fewer flowering stems in more northern latitudes. And I think what this does is integrating some influence of water source and soil chemistry. Getting into our bulrushes, alkali bulrush was found most often in intact wetland complexes where the surrounding land use was primarily wetlands. It also produced most biomass in those same places. However, one of the features that made it produce the most flowering stems was the percent of the growing season dry. The drier the wetland, the more flowering stems it produced. This is directly counter to the relationship between disturbance and condition, but right in line with what we expect for alkali bulrush. Chenoplectus americanus is an odd plant. It is found most often where surrounding land use was agricultural. It kind of likes that level of landscape disturbance. However, because surrounding use was primarily agriculture, it was found in a lot of pastures. There's a lot of grazing of this species. So biomass production might have been driven by soil pH, but it was also definitely brought down by cows actually chewing on it. And that also affected the number of flowering stems I found. So you can be suspicious of that too. The last species, alkali or hardstem bulrush, is kind of our most sensitive to disturbance. It is found in places that are primarily fresh water. It produces more biomass at a more neutral pH, and it produces the most flowering stems where soil ammonium is low. It'll produce fewer stems and grow fewer biomass as we start making the soil chemistry a little more challenging. So that was a lot, but we can summarize it with this ordination. I stuck with just those 5 species that we plotted, and you can see the center of each group are in different places on this graph, and there's a much more diverse group of environmental predictors driving changes in this. Basically, each plant is doing its own thing based on what its adaptations are to. It's also providing some habitat function, but this is linked to a lot more of the environmental variation around Great Salt Lake rather than anthropogenic disturbance. So that is everything, but I'd like to give a few conclusions before. So what we found is that the impact of impoundment is to create this diversity of wetland types on the landscape. Found that one of the drivers of condition on the landscape was the hydro period, and in impounded wetlands, the drier the hydro period, the poorer the condition. Looking at any overlap between assessment monitoring and wetland management, found that there is not a lot of overlap there, but that there's also not really a trade-off between managing for waterfowl and maintaining condition. And then we looked at the variety of environmental influences driving habitat function and how that is different from what is driving condition. I didn't do this all by myself, and I wish I could thank everybody from Logan, but I'm going to have to focus and first thank my funding sources. So this was primarily funded by the Environmental Protection Agency through their Wetland Program Development grants. Then I also received grants from the Ecology Center at Utah State, Friends of Great Salt Lake, and the Division of Water Quality. I would also like to thank the Division of Water Quality for hiring me. It's awesome. I owe heaps and heaps of thanks to the land managers that let me access their land and made sure I did it safely and rescued me when I was on the wrong side of a locked gate or locked out of my car. I also appreciate the time that my interview participants gave me. The information I got there was super interesting, and you should definitely read my dissertation when it comes out because the details are there and they're great. And then my committee members. These 5 have been delightful to work with. We've got a lot of diverse perspectives, and they're very, very sharp and have been very fun to work with. Interestingly enough, this semester marks 10 years since I took my first class from Joanna. She's been advising me ever since, which is pretty cool. I also need to thank my lab family. They have been wonderful to work with. They've helped me out with field work, and they've been very, very supportive. And then my family, the Downard, Lundstrom, Lundland, Kalamakia families, who provide a lot of emotional support there. And then my person, Brent, who has fed me over the last month and made sure we go on a lot of fun adventures in between there. And with that, I'll take questions. This is Marsh Lama. No questions? Peter.
Would introducing greater temporal variation in impoundment water levels help? You know, just make them go up and down throughout the year?
It could potentially help in unimpounded wetlands, kind of stimulate the growth of fast-growing emergent species. One of the challenges there is that potential, or that fluctuating water level might potentially lead to outbreaks of avian botulism. So if that happened when the birds were there, we could have big bird die-offs. But generally, the goal inside the impoundments is to have one big fluctuating event like that to expose the soil surface, kind of aerate the soils, and encourage the germination of emergent species.
And more frequent ones would not necessarily be helpful.
Right, it would potentially stress these robust emergent perennial species. Yes.
I'm wondering if there's other indicators you would look at if you had more time besides vegetation?
Yes.
Like macroinvertebrates or animals?
I think macroinvertebrates would be particularly interesting in the unimpounded wetlands. Maybe they would be more responsive to disturbance than plants. So given the opportunity, I'd like to do that. I did try and look at migratory bird use during the last year of my study, tried to count birds in my reference wetlands and in my porous condition wetlands using a drone. And what I found is that with that group of wildlife, they can move wherever they want, and they care more about water than they do about condition. All right, well, thank you so much for your time, and I guess I'll go talk to my committee now.